You open the book, you read every word, you finish the last page, and then someone asks you what it was about, and your mind goes completely blank. You know you just spent hours with this book. You know the cover. You know where you sat while reading it. You can vaguely recall a general mood, but the actual ideas, the arguments, the thing the author spent years trying to say, you've got nothing. Maybe you mumble something like, it was interesting. And there it is. That quiet, familiar disappointment. Not just the embarrassment of not knowing, the private question that comes after. What is wrong with my brain? Over time, that question doesn't stay a question. It settles into an answer. You tell yourself you just have a bad memory. Some people can read a book and talk about it for an hour. You read the same book, and a week later, you can barely remember the title. And you've seen this pattern enough times that you've stopped being surprised by it. It just feels like who you are. You might even notice yourself avoiding books that seem too dense or too important. Because honestly, what's the point? You'll just forget them anyway. The label bad memory doesn't just explain your past. It starts quietly shaping your future. It tells you not to bother, and you walk away carrying a very specific, very private shame. But here's where things get strange. Think about the last time someone told you a piece of gossip, or the last movie you really loved, or a complicated social situation or at work where you had to track who said what, who meant what, and what all of it was really about. You can probably recall those things in vivid, precise detail. You can describe character arcs from a film you saw 2 years ago. You can reconstruct a conflict between coworkers with the accuracy of a court reporter. That information is in your head, organized, connected, ready to be pulled out. So if you really had a bad memory, the kind that was just broken hardware, how would that be possible? A machine that can't hold information shouldn't be able to hold some information perfectly and other information not at all. This is the moment where the old explanation starts to crack. Because the truth isn't that you can't remember things. The truth is that when you read a book, you may never have actually put the information into memory in the first place. You were moving your eyes across words, and your brain was treating it like throwing unlabeled files into a dark room. There's a difference between receiving information and encoding it. Encoding is the process of taking something you're experiencing and converting it into a form your brain can store and retrieve later. When you remember a movie, you didn't sit there trying to memorize it. Your brain encoded it automatically because it had meaning, emotion, cause and effect, faces and voices you cared about. But when you read passively, just letting sentences wash over you, the material often never gets that treatment. It enters the darkroom. The file has no label, and when you reach for it later, you're not searching, you're just hoping, and hope isn't a retrieval system. The reason this went on for so long without you noticing is that passive reading came with a very convincing lie. Every time you turned a page, every time you highlighted a sentence, you felt a small wave of familiarity. You recognized the words, the ideas seemed clear in the moment, and that feeling of clarity tricked your brain into thinking the information was being absorbed. But recognizing something while it sits in front of your eyes is not the same as being able to reconstruct it when the book is closed. Highlighting makes the illusion even stronger. It gives you a tiny motor action that feels productive. Your hand moves across the page. The fluorescent line appears beneath a sentence. Something has been marked. Something has been done, but nothing in that motion forces your brain to build the idea. So you finish the chapter feeling like you learned something. And then a week later, you go back and look at the highlighted sentences and they read like someone else's notes. They don't feel like yours. The words are there on the page, underlined and bright, and you cannot tell yourself what they meant. That's the moment it drops in your stomach, not just as a thought, but as a physical recognition. The page was marked, but the mind was not. The file was never saved. And this is where the real shift happens. None of this was because you were lazy or stupid. You were given a task, read a book, and you did it in the most natural way a human brain knows how, by letting your eyes follow the path of least resistance. The problem wasn't your ability. The problem was that no one ever told you what reading for memory actually requires. You don't have a broken storage system. You have a functioning brain that was never given the right instructions for how to treat the information you were feeding it. You're not someone with a bad memory. You're someone who has been using the wrong encoding protocol without realizing there was another option. Let that land for a second, because that means the shame was never the final truth. It was a diagnosis made too early. The new posture is quieter than most reading advice makes it sound. It doesn't require elaborate note-taking systems or flashcards or memorizing the table of contents. It starts with one shift in how you see reading itself. Right now, your brain may treat a book like a lecture. You sit there, the author talks, you try to absorb. But absorption doesn't create memory. Conversation does. If you can reframe reading as a dialogue rather than a monologue, something changes. Instead of asking only, what is the author saying? You begin asking, what is the author trying to convince me of? And do I actually agree? That single question changes the way your brain processes every paragraph. Now, you're not just receiving words, you're evaluating them, testing them against your own experience, preparing a response. And you don't need to do this for every sentence. You just need to create one real moment of contact. When you finish a section, close the book, not forever, not dramatically, just close it for 10 seconds. Sit there in the silence before the next page can rescue you from having to think. Your mind may resist at first. It may want to keep moving forward because forward motion feels like progress. But stay there for a moment and ask yourself, in your own words, what is the single idea the author most wanted me to take away from this part? That's it. You don't need to summarize everything. You don't need to sound smart. You don't need to produce a beautiful note. You only need to translate one central idea from the author's language into your own. Say it to yourself like you were explaining it to a friend who wasn't there. And in that small act, something becomes yours. The book stops being a stream of sentences passing through you. It becomes a set of ideas you have handled, turned over, questioned, and placed somewhere with intention. That tiny act of translation is the encoding event. Once it happens, the information is no longer floating somewhere in the dark. It has a label now. It has a handle. It is connected to a question you cared about enough to ask. The next time you pick up a book and then forget what it said, you don't need to attack yourself for it. The forgetting was never the deepest problem. It was the symptom. And for the first time, you may have the diagnosis right. You're not someone who can't remember. You're someone who was watching the scenery instead of building the map. You can read the same book again with a different posture. You can show up not as a passive receiver, but as someone in a conversation with another mind. Someone who spent years thinking about something and is now trying to hand it to you. Your job is not to catch every word. Your job is to notice what is being handed to you, hold it for a moment, and decide what you think about it. That is not a burden. That is the whole point. That is what makes reading not just something you finish, but something that actually stays. If you want more quiet ways to make your mind feel like your own again, subscribe. Keep this place close for the next idea that needs somewhere to stay.